A few minutes. Welcome everyone. We'll get started in a few minutes as people are pouring in from the waiting room. In the meantime, you can feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat as always. Welcome everyone. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat as we come in. We'll give it one more minute as people are coming in from the waiting room. Welcome everyone. Thanks to everyone who's introducing themselves in the chat. Great to see we have an audience from all over the country. Some familiar names, some new people. Glad to have you all here. Great, we'll get started in about 30 more seconds. All right, I think that the waiting room flow has slowed down, so I'll go ahead and get started. Hi everyone, I'm Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer at NLIHC. Really excited to welcome you all to our webinar today on ballot measures and housing. And I'm especially excited to welcome our guest panelists, Ben Kelly and Chris Bowen. As a reminder, please feel free to use the Q&A feature throughout the webinar, as we'll have time to ask our panelists some questions. As another reminder, as always, this webinar is being recorded. The recording and the resources will be sent out afterwards, but it'll look a little bit different than it's looked before. So rather than getting a standalone email tomorrow, we're compiling all of our follow-up resources from all of our many NLIHC calls into one Friday newsletter called The Connection. So keep an eye out for The Connection. It'll hit your inboxes Friday afternoon. Click the link at the top to Our Homes, Our Votes, and you'll get those resources as you usually would. So I think that's all for my opening announcements. With that, I'm gonna pass it over to Ben to get us started. Ben, you're on mute.
Now I am unmuted. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ben Kelly, and I am a researcher and a public affairs consultant based in Denver. And I want to thank Courtney and her team for inviting me to be on this webinar and to talk to you folks today about what's going to be on the ballot in housing-related ballot questions this November. So my background is in land use consulting and political campaigns and communications and housing policy, and a project that I work on is watching the yearly cycle of elections with an emphasis on local elections in local jurisdictions and tracking ballot measures that are directly tied to housing. And I'm going to walk through what I'm seeing coming on in ballots locally this November, but just a little preface beforehand. And I think a little bit why I think these ballot measures are so vital and compelling. First of all, for better or for worse, they are a point in time snapshot of public opinion on housing issues in particular communities. And more often than not, they can be opportunities for communities to open the door just a little bit wider to affordable housing and to help create more inclusive communities. And thirdly, I think they're interesting because they are such two-sided coins. They can result in really amazing achievements in resourcing affordable housing and being a catalyst to delivering more affordable housing and making our communities more inclusive. But it's also a very blunt instrument. I mean, voters are faced with a ballot, are being asked to make an up or down decision in an arena that everyone on this call knows is complex and nuanced and really consequential. So that tension between the complexity of housing issues and sort of the deceptively simple exercise of casting a ballot decision, I think is what makes this such an interesting political and policy space. Next slide, please. So the housing ballot measures take several forms, and I tend to organize them into these four buckets. First, starting on the left here on your screen, are bonds. And this is seeking voter approval for public borrowing that supports affordable housing with subsidy at some level in the development process. The second category is broadly, I describe as taxes, and creating or targeting a tax stream for the purpose of affordable housing. The third category is zoning, and this is when voters are asked to weigh in on zoning maps and land use rules that have some upstream relationship, usually to density and housing development, and as often is the case, to affordable housing. And the fourth is really what I just kind of call policy. Bonds are policy, taxes are policy, zoning is policy, but my policy category is really a catch-all where voters are asked for an up or down vote on various housing regulations. And here I would place rent control, eviction protections, a policy addressing homelessness, and generally how cities oversee and regulate affordable housing. So those are kind of the four categories that I tend to use as kind of an overarching organizational approach to this. Next slide, please. So in this November election window, my tracking, I'm counting in the neighborhood of about 55 housing-related ballot measures in local elections. And to put this into some context, I did this same exercise in 2021, and the number of housing-related ballot questions in that cycle, in that window, was right around 30. So in this November, the number of housing-related ballot measures has almost doubled. And in this snapshot, I'm not counting about half a dozen, I think, important ballot measures that have already occurred this year in municipal elections in the spring and early part of the summer. So in these four categories, on the bond side, I'm tracking 16 jurisdictions that have bond measures on the November ballot. And the grand total of what they are seeking voter approval for across those jurisdictions is nearly $1.5 billion in public financing. As far as taxes go, I'm counting 20 tax questions on ballots this November. And they're asking voters to okay funding for housing through excise, property taxes, real estate transfer taxes, lodging, and other tax sources. One of these, a transfer tax in Los Angeles, you'll hear about from Chris in just a few minutes. There are about a dozen ballot measures related to zoning. And broadly, this can be an area-wide zoning amendment, or narrowly, this can be an up or down vote on a specific project or a specific development where usually because of some conflict and tension around the approval, the governing body has or is either referred it to the ballot or residents have petitioned to have it referred to the ballot. And in this last category of policy, There's 13 or so referred measures in policy and regulations: rent control, eviction protections, homelessness policy, and housing oversight. And this count is as of just yesterday. We're still in a window, and I'll get to this in a second. We're still in a window where things can fall off the ballot just at the mid-September timeframe. But I'm really kind of observing in the mid-50s of ballot measures to watch. So I want to focus in the rest of my time here just on a couple categories within those four, and that's rent control and tenant protections. So next slide, please. So I want to review briefly some rent control and tenant protection ballot measures that voters will weigh in on this November. And I'll just kind of go left to right here on your screen. In Santa Monica, which has one of the longest standing rent control codes of a municipality in the US, and they periodically go to voters to ask for adjustments and tweaks and substantive changes to their rent control code. This year's ballot, they're asking Santa Monica voters to add market rate rental units to their rental registry, where they track their rental housing inventory citywide. They're going to ask voters to raise thresholds on just cause evictions. And they're also going to lower the maximum allowable rent increase on their rent control units from a current cap of 6% down to 3%. Right next door in Pasadena, they are asking voters to approve really a robust new rent control and tenant protection regulatory framework that does many things. I think the three main components is setting a maximum annual rent increase rate of 75% of the local inflation rate. Second, strengthening the city's existing just cause eviction procedures. And third, creating a new rental registry of the rent controlled inventory in the city, and a new commission to oversee the implementation of the policy. So in many ways, Pasadena is asking its voters to kind of create a framework that is as robust and built into their city charter as Santa Monica has had for going on, I think, more than 20 years. Going north in California, in Oakland, voters there will weigh in on expanding Oakland's just cause eviction procedures to cover more rental properties in the city that are currently covered. For example, the eviction protections in Oakland only apply to apartments constructed before 1996. So with this amendment to their rent control ordinance, they would expand those just cause eviction protections to a much broader set of rental inventory in the city of Oakland. And then next door to Oakland in Richmond, California, they're going to ask voters to adjust the maximum allowable rent increase on rent control units from what is currently the 100% of the inflation rate to a maximum of to either two things, either a maximum of 60% of the current rate of inflation or 3%, whichever is lower. So they're trying to fine tune their maximum rent control level. Going to Florida, and this will be a very interesting one to watch, especially given a lot of uncertainties with if voters approve this, how this will thread the needle with state law. But in Orange County, Florida, with this capital, which is Orlando, the county seat is Orlando, they're asking voters to approve a 1-year rent control regulation that would tie the maximum allowable rent increase to the rate of inflation. And there are some carve outs to this. It would only apply to multifamily buildings and exempting single family detached units that are rentals, and only apply to landlords who own more than 4 units. So this has been a windy road to get referred to the ballot. There, as I mentioned, will be a lot of friction with state law in Florida. But among several jurisdictions that have been talking about rent control and putting something on the ballot this November, Orange County in Florida is the one that has been referred to the ballot. And then in Portland, Maine, Portland, Maine voters approved rent control in 2020, and this election is a follow-on to that. And they're going to ask their voters to weigh in several aspects of their rent control code. They're going to ask voter approval on a 90-day required notice of rent increases or evictions, prohibiting application fees for rental housing, restricting deposits to 1 month rent, and limiting the maximum allowable rent increases to no more than 70% of the rate of inflation. So that's, I think, a quick snapshot on rent control and tenant protection ballot measures this November. And next slide, please. I want to put a spotlight on a ballot measure, this one preceding that. Was there one preceding that, Courtney? Oh, I don't know what happened to the slide. So let me talk about one slide on renter protections, and this is in Denver. There's an advocacy group that has noticed and really done a very focused job on focusing on a particular policy gap that they want to cover with a ballot measure. And they identified a problem, which is the rare instances where individuals and households who are facing eviction rarely show up to eviction court proceedings with legal counsel. And research on Denver's eviction court showed that commercial landlords show up to eviction proceedings in court with legal counsel 90% of the time, while renters showed up with legal counsel only 1% of the time. And I think this was a window in 2019 and 2020 with a database of, I think, 3,000 or 4,000 evictions. And also noted that when families did show up, or households did show up with legal representation, half of the evictions were avoided. So the group's ballot measure in Denver is really focused on trying to address this imbalance. And what they've proposed on the ballot is asking voters to approve the creation of a free legal assistance program that provides attorneys and legal support to individuals and households that are facing eviction. And they want to fund this with a tax on landlords of $75 per year per unit, which they estimate will raise about $12 million a year to fund this legal assistance. And this has been a long road to get to the ballot. They got their petition approved by the Denver officials in early summer 2021, spent the summer gathering signatures, and were authorized for the ballot in September 2021. So they've had a very long runway to get where they are now. And they're all set to be on Denver ballots this November 8th. So what's next? Like the next 64 days, and I'm sure that number for Chris is very front and center. It's 64 days until Election Day. There's still about a week where there might be some slight shifts in what ends up or gets moved off the ballot, but usually by mid-September, these ballots get firmed up and set. Voting in jurisdictions which have early voting can start as early as mid-October. And I'll be watching the campaigns in these 50-plus jurisdictions, really with an eye towards how campaign resources are deployed and where they come from, the messaging and coalitions that are formed around campaigns. And I'm also watching how local ballot measures are influenced and how they're shaped by what else is on ballots. And just like a couple examples, Austin, Texas, their city council has referred a $350 million bond measure for affordable housing to their ballot this November 8th. And Austin voters resoundingly approved a pretty sizable bond measure for housing just a year or two ago. On the same ballot, Austin voters will weigh in on a $2.4 billion bond measure that was referred by their school district. So two very substantive and high dollar figure bond measures on the same ballot. I'll be curious to see the voting patterns on both of those and how they influence each other or interact with each other. Another example is Oakland. We looked just a couple slides ago at their rent control amendments into their rent control code. And what will be the outcome of that election on the same ballot where their city council has referred a $350 million, actually it's more than $600 million all told in a bond measure for infrastructure, $350 million of which is targeted towards affordable housing. So I'll be curious and be watching how these ballot measures interact and what the turnout dynamics are this November. And I'm also looking ahead to what is positioning for ballots as we move into 2023. Some ballot measures that did not make deadlines in 2022 are already kind of setting plans ahead for petitioning or getting referred to the ballot in jurisdictions this next year, whether that's in kind of springtime municipal elections or the November election window almost a year from now. So that's the end of my summary. I think I've got a few minutes for questions if I can answer them. But thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Ben. It's really so helpful to have this landscape, kind of that really systematic breakdown of the different types of ballot measures and what to expect going forward. We got a question in the chat from Gina on how will these rent control measures impact affordable housing development?
There's many schools of thought on that. There's the two ends of the spectrum is that the passage of rent control measures will put a hard stop to rental residential development across the jurisdiction. There's another school of thought, and both of these ends are supported by piles of economic and academic research. But the other end of the spectrum is that in solving or addressing rental workforce housing or affordable housing through rent control, that does not have a negative impact on real estate development. So it's, I think for every analysis to match a different point of view on what happens. And I think, my eyes would turn towards jurisdictions that have approved rent control, even in recent years. I think even this last year in St. Paul, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and seeing what the patterns are in development patterns and what gets built in the near term and midterm and long term in those jurisdictions. So I think for every point of view, there's a lot of crystal ball gazing, but I think that's kind of the $1 million question is what will this do to development? And I think it's there's a pretty broad chorus of response.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I saw Mrs. Brown shared in the Q&A an article that kind of may weigh in on one side of this debate or the other. I'm just going to copy that into the chat because I don't think everyone can see the Q&A. So thanks for sharing that, Mrs. Brown. I actually had a question. So I've gotten some questions from people who are kind of, they know that they have a local housing crisis. They know that they want to get housing on the ballot, but aren't really sure where to start. What advice would you give to someone, maybe a local elected official or an organizer that wants to craft a housing related ballot measure in terms of like which of those different policy mechanisms to choose? Is there a way you'd give them direction in like getting started and what to put on the ballot in the first place?
Well, I have two reactions to that question. First of all, you mentioned elected officials, people in the affordable housing space in communities, advocacy groups. I think the first step is, I think the best results come with a broad coalition around a table to come up with identifying range of problems that need to be addressed and the range of solutions that can be targeted to address them. So my first response is nobody can do this alone. It takes a very broad coalition and different perspectives on kind of the housing landscape to even start to build a case to what that housing ballot measure should be. And I think another sort of guidepost is, what does state law say, especially with regard to issues like rent control? For example, in Columbus, Ohio, there's an advocacy group that has come together and developed a very intricate and detailed policy framework for rent control for the city of Columbus that they hope to put on the ballot this November. And then the state legislature passed preemptive legislation just this past spring that really got them off course. And I think sort of that interaction between what happens at the local level and what the state law allows and does not allow is a pretty important preliminary thing to establish. And I think we'll see some of that in what happens in Orange County, Florida as well, especially if voters in Orange County approve that 1 year rent control. So a broad coalition, and also understanding the relationship between what's allowed at the state level or what's permitted in state statute, and how that relates to what people want to have happen at a local level.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I know that a lot of advocates run into those frustrating issues with preemptive state laws, having a really amazing idea, but running into those obstacles. Yeah, so I think those are all the questions we have time for right now. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you.
And I'm now going to pass it over to Chris.
All right. Fantastic. Well, thanks so much. My name is Chris Bowen. I am the public policy organizer at the Southern California Association for Nonprofit Housing. And before I get going, I just wanted to offer a couple of reflections on Ben's portion of the presentation. He had mentioned 64 days left on the campaign, but who's counting? Definitely us. It's definitely on my calendar, Ben, and I think many of us on this call are feeling the pinch as we get closer to Election Day. And I just really appreciated that kind of macro overview that Ben just did, giving us a national overview. And I'm going to give you a glimpse into what's going on in the city of Los Angeles, the second largest city in the country. And so a little bit of background on the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing. We actually represent 5 counties. Of course, the largest county in terms of population being Los Angeles County has 10 million people in it just alone, which is the size of about 42 states. And then we're going to add Orange County, San Bernardino, Riverside, and Ventura counties. However, while we represent about 20 million people, the 800-pound gorilla in the room very regularly is the city of Los Angeles. It sets the tone not only for the county of Los Angeles, but for the region, for the state, and to a certain degree, the rest of the country. So we recognize that when we're putting together this initiative, that it could have a wide-reaching impact. And so I wanted to share with you a little bit about what we are doing. And so Ben had mentioned, there was a question in the question and answer period about how we could get something on the ballot. And I really liked Ben's answer, talking about a broad coalition. And in the next slide, I will talk to you a little bit more, and then subsequent slides about who we are and the people that we are working together with to get this ballot initiative passed. But so I told you about where we are representing, but we are a membership association of organizations and individuals dedicated to the creation and preservation of affordable housing. Like many of you, we're made up of nonprofit developers, government officials, architects, policymakers, students, activists, and others. Next slide. And so our mission is to facilitate development of affordable homes across California by advancing effective public policies, sustainable financial resources, strong member organization, and beneficial partnerships, of which I will touch on shortly. And so what we do We are talking about broad systems change. We're talking about industry-wide capacity building, educational workshops and things like that. We do not advocate for specific developments. We do not have developer members compete for same resources and things of that nature. So that's just a little bit about what we do and what we don't do. Next slide, please. Okay, and so now the moment you've all been waiting for, the details about this measure. And so this measure is a one-time fee during a sale of high-value properties. And so there would be a property transfer fee of 4% on properties over $5 million. And on properties over $10 million, that would be 5.5%. And it would create a Los Angeles program to prevent homelessness and fund affordable housing. So we're very excited about this. It will generate nearly $900 million annually, which is a lot of money. So we'll talk a little bit later about where that money will go. Next slide, please. Okay, and so interesting bit is that, oh, next slide, please, is that this measure was actually written by citizens, and it was led by our non-for-profit homelessness and housing experts, not politicians. So I think that that was a discussion previously about having the politicians be involved. We actually took this ballot initiative directly to the voters, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in our timeline, but we felt that the politicians were not acting in the way that we wanted. And so in order to get to the policy that we want, we took this ballot initiative directly to the voters. And we learned from, I should say, past measures to create this one. Next slide, please. And so this is an ongoing, sustainable, and permanent source of funding. And so there's some references here that folks might not understand, but HHH was it was an initiative that was passed in the city of Los Angeles, and H was countywide in the county of Los Angeles. But those are temporary funding sources. And as many of you on the call are probably aware, we're constantly looking for permanent sources of funding, so we don't have to go back every year and ask and beg for more money for affordable housing development and preservation. So this is a more holistic approach. Our measure reduces and prevents homelessness in 3 key ways: by buying, building, and preserving places for homeless people to live, by sending direct cash assistance to people in need so they can remain in their homes and prevent homelessness, and 3, by making the most significant investment in tenant protections in the history of Los Angeles to ensure that people can stay housed. And so it is an important combination of the 3 and not just that 1 or 2 pronged approach. Next slide, please. And so this does provide support to people experiencing homelessness and those at risk of homelessness with rental assistance, income assistance for low-income seniors, and access to permanent housing. And so you might be asking yourself, what will all of this money go to? It will build housing. It creates more than 26,000 homes in 10 years for people who are experiencing homelessness or are at risk of homelessness, helping nearly 70,000 people. It supports renters, helping more than 475,000 at-risk renters maintain their stability and keep their home each year. And many of you on the call recognize that that is a preventative measure that can save millions of dollars just by making that smaller investment upfront. Strong oversight. This is something that folks really want to see. And this includes the strongest citizen oversight and accountability protections in the history of our city, including a dedicated inspector general with independent funding. It will create jobs, 44,000 construction jobs over the next decade, with strong labor provisions that will ensure a skilled workforce and address wage inequities that address the very crisis that we seek to solve. Next slide, please. Okay, so we do have community protections. The target is for people experiencing homelessness or at risk. And so we're talking about the AMI, 15% or less in a family of 4, or 30% or less. And so we do have low income renter support, and we do have assistance for our seniors. And so these are kind of the focuses of the ballot initiative. Next slide, please. And so it is really important to focus on this, especially because we do, believe it or not, it's probably very believable for many of you, have detractors. We have folks that are nervous about a property transfer, any type of tax. And so we want to, and we are focusing on the fact that 97% of these property sales will be unaffected. And so this is really, so when we're talking about properties over $5 million, we're really talking about 3% of the property sales. And many of these sales are not residential. And so we also need to focus on that. But just note that a supermajority of the sales that are taking place in the city of Los Angeles will be completely unaffected by this. Next slide, please. Okay, and so how will this streamline and expedite development? It will provide comprehensive financing and policy tactics, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. We're going to get delegated authority to the LA Housing Department for projects where the city is committing 50 million or less. This measure gives authority to LA Housing Department to make the approval process easier, taking the process out of the city council's hands, as long as it complies with the goals set forth by the oversight committee. And so many of you are probably experiencing this as well, but whenever you get a large political body involved in any type of decision-making process, it delays things by months and sometimes years. So if we're able to delegate that authority to professionals who do this all day, we think that that will be more effective and efficient. Also, this will mitigate risks. Substantial and consistent funds provide certainty and will put more buildings into the pipeline. Many of the investors that are looking into building affordable housing are hesitant to do so because they are not sure if the funding will be there. So this would be a permanent source of funding, and it would make sure that things are continually coming online. Really important. Next slide, please. And so, as discussed before this, we will have a robust oversight, and the measure will include the most robust oversight, citizens oversight and transparency in the history of the city of Los Angeles, a paid citizens oversight committee with specific expertise on the issues of housing and lived experience with homelessness, appointed by the mayor, a professional staff that reports to the citizen oversight committee led by the inspector general, funded through the measure, and is focused on ensuring compliance in the measure's eligible uses, very limited ability for the city council to change any eligible uses for the funding. Really important point there. Next slide, please. And so this citizens initiative actually only requires 50 plus 1% to pass this November. It is not a replacement for the county Measure H funding. It is not a countywide program. It is a city. It is a city program. Next slide. Okay, and so now we can get a little bit more into the funding. And the funding is basically broken down. 70% is for affordable housing and 30% is for homeless prevention programs. And next slide, we can show a little bit of the breakdown if you are interested. It's a little bit in small font, but this will go out, I believe, to all of the attendees that are here a little bit later on. But for those of you that can't see that fine print, it is 22 to 25% going into supportive and affordable housing. Alternative models for permanent supportive housing get 22 to 25%, 10% for preservation funds, 10% for single family and cooperative homeownership opportunities, 10% for funding for eviction, prevention, and defense programs, 10% for income assistance to rent burdened households, with acuity, extremely, and very low income households. So we're really focusing, and there was a comment in the chat below, yeah, 15% AMI, yeah, it is extremely targeted, and we are trying to really focus on this, and this is impacting much of California, but of course you hear about the larger cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and others that are really trying to tackle very low income and the homelessness crisis that are existing in our cities. And so we feel that this ballot initiative will really get to the core of that and bringing the experts in. Next slide, please. Okay, we already talked about the 30% on here. And so I was really impressed by the advice that Ben gave earlier, talking about the broad coalition. And so we are part of a coalition that helped write and are overseeing the campaign that includes ACT LA, Kiwa, Unite Here Local 11, SAGE, Venice Community Housing, Inner City Law Center, and others. We also have been coming together with local labor unions, Move LA, transit-oriented organizations. All of us have a shared goal. And so really important to bring that broad coalition together, because I'll tell you what, we don't all have the exact same vision, but very, very similar. And that's what's helping us achieve the polling numbers that you're about to see in the next slides. So we have been endorsed by over 140 organizations. It's really quite lengthy, so you can take a look at that, but I hit some of the key ones already. Oh, we might get a zoom in there, I see, which would be great. But yeah, you can see from Jewish organizations like Bend the Arc to East LA Community Corporation, Esperanza Community Housing, NoHo Homes Alliance, just some of these are Trust South LA. It's citywide. It's from the east side to the west side, from the San Fernando Valley down to the South Bay. We do have a lot of organizations, and we talked about not just geographic diversity, but also diversity of interests. And so you see a lot of these folks, including labor, coming together with housing, with transit, and pushing for this really critical ballot initiative. Next slide. Oh yeah, we're zoomed in there still. Excellent. Okay, so the timeline. The timeline is in December of 2021, we filed for a ballot measure. A month later, we got the ballot title secured, and then February through April, we were working on getting that ballot title and summary approved. By April and May, we submitted our signatures to the city clerk. Those signatures were enough to qualify us. We qualified for the November ballot. And so now we are in campaign mode. And so right now, I referenced earlier that we would take a look at the polling. Polling right now shows us at 60 to 63%. We are only requiring a 50+1% to get this ballot initiative passed. However, we do not want to just get the bare minimum. We do want to achieve the maximum amount to show not only does the city support this with a majority, they support this with a super majority, and they are looking for a mandate in terms of change within the city. And our coalition is working every day. And I'll tell you, for the next 64 days, as Ben pointed out, I will be going door to door, speaking with residents in affordable housing, speaking with folks in single family homes, living in market rate units, speaking with anyone who is willing to hear us out, that we must pass this ballot initiative this November. Next slide, please. Oh, you know what? It looks like I have reached the end of my presentation. But if there are any questions, I don't know if we have time for a few, but I'll defer to Courtney. But that is a little bit of what we are up to in the city of Los Angeles.
Thanks so much, Chris. I do have a question. I'm just seeing a lot of enthusiasm in the chat. I'm seeing a lot of enthusiasm that this is really deeply targeted to those with the greatest needs at 15% of AMI. Also, Valerie shared some information about another ballot measure related to campaign finance in LA. So definitely a lot of enthusiasm here. One question that I wanted to ask, so you mentioned some past ballot measures, Measure H and HHH, that have funded affordable housing in the city and county. And I'm curious how this campaign has built on the kind of organizing infrastructure from those campaigns and incorporated lessons learned that in what it took to get those passed?
Okay, that's a fantastic question. Yeah, when Measure H and when Triple H were passed, they were a big deal. People were very supportive of the both of those initiatives, and we did see that broad coalition. However, since those ballot initiatives were passed, we have seen there's some folks that are well-intentioned and supported those initiatives and want them to be successful. But there are others that never supported those ballot initiatives and never wanted them to be seen as successful. And they have been slowly chipping away, criticizing those ballot initiatives. So at this juncture in 2022, we are actually a little bit in a tougher position than Measure H and Triple H prior to it, because there is a certain level of skepticism amongst the general public about where what's going on. And so you saw in the presentation really specific items related to oversight and making sure that we know exactly where the money is going. People are going to have input about that, and really a very detailed breakdown about where that money is going. And so we were trying to learn some of those lessons from the past, not specifically from the campaigns, but from the subsequent fallout after their passage. And so that's just a little bit about the lessons learned. But more broadly, talking about that very large coalition, and there is kind of a knee-jerk reaction to say, let's get together with the people that agree with us the most and put together a ballot initiative, and let's keep all the other voices out. And that might be great to be able to put together a very targeted ballot initiative for exactly what your organization wants. But it might not be able to get you to 50, 60, 65% of the vote that you want to show that you have broad support. So that's why it's so important to do that coalition building.
Thank you. And we got a question from Penny that I think this could be a whole webinar of its own, but Penny was asking for information about new and innovative housing options related to development and construction. I saw Ben popped up here too, so maybe if either of you has some suggestions for Penny.
That's a great question, Penny. The first thing that comes to my mind is this November, there are a couple ballot measures that have come across my radar screen, I think related to put it simply, to affordable housing dedicated towards teachers in high-cost communities. There's a school district in East San Jose that I think is going to ask their voters to approve sort of the allocation of some remainder funding from a prior bond measure to help subsidize some housing for their teacher their teacher population. And also in Jackson, Wyoming, in Teton County, there's a partnership that's going to be on the ballot in that jurisdiction, which is sort of a partnership between the county, I believe the city of Jackson, and the school district to try to come up with a way to build some housing that supports the teachers who are priced out of that market. And I think we'll see more of those, especially in high cost markets that are losing their ability to attract and retain teachers. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind, is something that might turn into a pattern to watch.
Thanks, Ben. Chris, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
No, I thought that was pretty comprehensive.
Great. I see Kent is adding in the chat that Dare County, North Carolina is building affordable housing for teachers in expensive beach areas. That's really great to see. Do we have any more questions?
I will certainly keep you all updated as we continuously move through this campaign, but we are feeling good about it.
Yes, it looks like it's really exciting. Those polling numbers are great. And I'm sure that with you being out there every single day talking to voters, they're only going to go up. So we're just really excited to see how the campaign shakes out, both in LA and all of the many other campaigns that Ben is keeping an eye on. So we have a few more minutes. I'm actually just going to talk for a bit about a resource that NLIHC has that some of you may have seen already because it's been out for a few months. But if you're just tuning in, if you haven't seen this before, I wanted to call your attention to a report that we wrote about ballot measures in the 2020 and 2021 election cycles and how you can learn lessons from the best practices of these campaigns to incorporate in 2022 and in future years. So I'm just going to give a little overview of this report, and Sid shared the link to that in the chat as well. So the report really begins with an overview of some of the legal rules around ballot measure advocacy. Again, for anyone who's new to ballot measures, the instinct might be, oh, well, this is campaigning, this is endorsing. Are you sure that we can do this as a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization? And the answer to that is yes. Again, nonprofits can't endorse campaigns, but you can't endorse campaigns for elected officials, but can endorse ballot measures. And these are treated like legislation rather than like candidates. So it's kind of like endorsing and lobbying for a bill, with the voters being the policymakers. And there's a really great resource from Boulder Advocacy. They have a ballot measures toolkit that really gets into some of the weeds of how to advocate for ballot measures as a 501c3 nonprofit. So we'll share that link in the chat as well. So the report opens with kind of that little clarification, and then we get into some of the housing and homelessness related ballot measures from the 2020 and 2021 election cycles. And I think Ben alluded to some of these too. And we break these ballot measures down into three categories, which are increasing resources for affordable housing, strengthening tenants' rights, and addressing homelessness. And within the category of increasing resources, we break down the particular ways that the ballot measure would go about increasing resources. So the ones that we highlighted from 2020 and 2021 did so by redirecting existing funds, raising real estate taxes, issuing bonds, and imposing fees on short-term rentals. And I know we see some of these categories popping up again with the ballot measures that will be put before the voters in this cycle. Within the category of tenant protections, we highlight rent stabilization and right to counsel in eviction court. And I know we're seeing a bunch of ballot measures, as Ben highlighted, that fall in these categories. And within the category of addressing homelessness, we highlight increasing resources for homelessness resolution and the defeat of a ballot measure that would have criminalized homelessness. So this section of the report summarizes ballot measures from 15 municipalities across 7 states. These are by no means the only housing-related ballot measures that passed in 2020 and 2021, but these are just some of the ones we pulled out as a bit of a sampling. And again, as we mentioned before, it's important to note that not all states allow ballot measures, and because of the rules governing them, they're much more common in some states than others. So again, as we've said before, looking into your state's rules is always an important first step if you're considering pursuing a ballot measure campaign. And the momentum around housing and homelessness related ballot measures at the local level, I think if there's one takeaway from this call, it's that voters are really ready for bold housing solutions, and they may be far ahead of what their elected officials are willing to enact. Bringing an issue directly to the voters can be a great way to pass an ambitious proposal that local officials may be reluctant to do. But these campaigns can be very expensive and very time-consuming. So that's why we produced this report. That's why we're hosting this webinar today. We really want to break down the best practices in ballot measure advocacy that can help you get your campaign off to a strong start. And these best practices include knowing the basics of ballot measures, designing the campaign based on your resources and capacity, building a strong and diverse base of support, mobilizing and following the leadership of directly impacted communities, developing clear messaging, harnessing the media, organizing accessible campaign activities, and integrating voter registration and mobilization into the campaign. And this last point really connects to something we've talked about through this entire webinar series, which is how to overcome apathy among voters that may feel like they haven't been supported by the political process. So why is it worth their time to turn out to vote? And there can be a really powerful, mutually reinforcing relationship between mobilizing voters and ballot measure advocacy. If there's something concrete on the ballot that can really mobilize those directly affected by housing policy, if you can say you have the chance to be a legislator and vote directly on rent stabilization or tenant protections or funding for affordable housing in your community, then that can really mobilize people to turn out to vote. And on the flip side, having a great policy doesn't get you very far unless your voters are actually turning out too. So throughout the report, we actually feature 3 case studies, and you can see snapshots from each of those on the screen. The campaign to permanently fund Philadelphia's Affordable Housing Trust Fund, the Keep St. Paul Home campaign to enact rent stabilization, and the campaign to fund Denver's homelessness resolution plans. I highly recommend reading the report to get the detailed stories of these winning ballot measures and get some deeper insights into proven strategies for organizing winning campaigns. We plan to publish another report next winter that will summarize ballot measure victories from the 2022 elections. So please reach out to us if you're working on a ballot measure this cycle. I know some of you have already shared those in the chat. We really want to learn about your work and we want to spotlight it in our resources. We can give you a newsletter write-up or something like that. So please be in touch with us if you're working on ballot measures. And so before we close out, switching gears a little bit, I know I shared an announcement about a grant opportunity last time from National Voter Registration Day, and I have an exciting announcement about another grant opportunity. This one is from our partners at Vote Early Day. MTV is offering grants to nonprofits that are planning in-person activations on Vote Early Day, which will take place on October 28th. And they're especially looking to fund activities geared towards young voters who have faced historical or institutional barriers to voting. These applications are due on September 18th, so you have a little bit of time, and recipients will hear back by September 27th. Please note that you have to be signed on as a Vote Early Day partner to be eligible. Luckily, that is super quick and easy to do. So we'll share the link both to the application for that MTV grant opportunity and also the link to the form to sign up as a Vote Early Day partner if you haven't done so already. And that provides a really perfect segue to my last announcement about our next webinar, which is on the topic of early voting and vote by mail. Our webinar on early voting and vote by mail will take place on Monday, September 19th. We'll be joined by Bryce Bennett, who's the project director at Vote Early Day, and Chris Wegner, Get Out the Vote coordinator at the Colorado Cross Disability Coalition. Hope to see everyone there. Not seeing, just gonna check and see if we have any last questions, but if not, then I think that brings us to the end. I also just wanted to apologize that we didn't have closed captioning available today, and we typically do. And I know that's really important for accessibility. So we just want to apologize for not having that featured today, and we will have it as usual on our next webinar. We also, when the recording is posted on YouTube, YouTube has a captioning feature. So we hope that for anyone who faced an accessibility challenge with that today, you'll be able to go in and use that feature. But really just wanted to apologize. We're aware that we had that issue today, and we'll definitely have it available again in future webinars. So thanks so much for being here. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks for being a great audience, and hope to see you all on September 19th.